I've always been good at disappearing. Not in the literal sense, though sometimes I wonder if that might be easier. I mean disappearing into pixels, into data streams, into the precise coordinates that define where one thing ends and another begins. For 8 years, I've been mapping digital worlds for companies that need their virtual landscapes cataloged down to the last polygon. It's solitary work, which suits me fine. People are complicated. Geography, even the artificial kind, makes sense. My apartment reflects this preference for isolation. 3 monitors dominate my desk, casting blue light across walls lined with star charts from my college astronomy days. I gave up on the real cosmos after graduation, when I realized that staring at distant suns through a telescope only emphasized how alone I was down here. But I kept the charts. Maybe I'm sentimental, or maybe I just never learned how to let go of beautiful things that hurt. The insomnia started about 6 months ago. At first, I blamed it on too much caffeine, too many late nights debugging coordinate systems. But even when I'd collapse into bed exhausted, sleep would slip away like water through cupped hands. I'd lie there watching shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the city breathe outside my window, feeling like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. That's when I found the technique. I wasn't looking for it specifically, just browsing obscure forums at 3 in the morning, the kind of digital rabbit holes that swallow insomniacs whole. Someone had posted about hypnagogic lucid dreaming, complete with detailed instructions that read like they'd been translated from another language. The method was simple in theory. Maintain consciousness while allowing your body to enter the paralysis of sleep. Hold on to awareness as it dissolves into dream. I tried it that same night, mostly out of desperation. The technique required me to focus on the space between waking and sleeping, that liminal moment when reality grows soft around the edges. I had to count backwards from 100 while visualizing myself sinking through layers of consciousness, letting go of my physical form without losing my sense of self. The first few attempts were failures. I'd either jolt awake or slip into ordinary sleep. But on the 4th night, something shifted. As I reached the deepest part of the countdown, I felt myself separate from my body like vapor rising from water. For a moment, I existed as pure consciousness, floating in a space that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light. Then I opened eyes I didn't know I had, and I was standing in a place that couldn't exist. The sky above me was the color of deep amethyst, crossed with aurora-like ribbons of gold and silver. 3 moons hung at different phases, their light painting everything in layers of lavender and pearl. I stood on a platform that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight, transparent but solid beneath my feet. In the distance, entire cities floated in the air like impossible dreams, connected by bridges of light that arced through the atmosphere. This was Zaharin, though I wouldn't learn its name until later. In that first moment, I could only stand and stare, my consciousness struggling to process beauty so alien it made my chest ache. The air tasted of ozone and something floral I couldn't identify. When I breathed in, I felt like I was inhaling liquid music. I took a step forward, then another. The platform extended into a walkway that curved away into a forest of trees unlike anything from Earth. Their trunks were silver white, smooth as polished bone, and their leaves glowed with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat. As I walked between them, I realized the light was responding to my presence, growing brighter as I approached, dimming as I moved away. That's when I saw my first glimpse of the inhabitants. A figure moved through the trees ahead of me, graceful and fluid in a way that made human movement seem clumsy by comparison. I caught only a flash of blue-tinged skin and eyes that reflected the forest's light like mirrors, but it was enough to make my heart race. I called out, but the figure vanished into the luminous shadows. I spent what felt like hours exploring that first night, though time seemed to move differently there. Sometimes I'd walk for what felt like minutes and find myself miles from where I started. Other times, I'd travel for what seemed like hours, only to discover I'd barely moved at all. The world operated on dream logic, but it was more real than any dream I'd ever experienced. I could feel the texture of the crystalline paths beneath my feet, smell the alien perfume of the glowing flowers, hear the distant music that seemed to emanate from the floating cities themselves. When I finally woke up, I was still lying in my bed, but something fundamental had changed. The gray walls of my apartment seemed thin and insubstantial, like cardboard painted to look like reality. I could still taste the strange sweetness of Zaharin's air. The memory of those impossible moons hung in my mind like afterimages. I went through the motions of my normal day, but everything felt hollow. I sat at my desk, mapped digital territories, responded to emails, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that crystalline platform and the figure I'd glimpsed in the glowing forest. By evening, I was counting the hours until I could attempt the technique again. The second night, I returned to the same platform, but the world had shifted. The floating cities had moved, their positions completely different from the night before. The forest of glowing trees had been replaced by a vast garden where flowers the size of dinner. Plates swayed in a breeze that carried whispers in a language I almost understood. I walked through it all like a tourist in paradise, documenting every detail, trying to understand the rules of this impossible place. It was on the third night that I encountered the predators. I was exploring a series of floating islands, connected by bridges of solidified light, when the aurora ribbons in the sky began to flicker and fade. The air grew cold, and something like static electricity made my skin prickle. Then I heard the sound, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They materialized out of the shadows between realities, things that weren't quite energy and weren't quite matter. They moved like liquid darkness given form, reaching toward me with appendages that shifted between tentacles and smoke. I ran, but in dreams, running sometimes means moving backwards or sideways or not at all. I could feel them gaining on me, their presence like ice water in my veins. That's when she appeared. One moment I was alone with the approaching nightmares. The next I was on the ground, and something was standing over me, fighting the shadow things with weapons that blazed like captured starlight. I looked up and saw my first clear view of one of Zaharin's inhabitants, and my breath caught in my throat. She was tall, maybe 6 feet, with skin that shifted between blue and silver, depending on how the light hit it. Her eyes were large and slanted, the color of deep ocean water with flecks of gold, and they held an intelligence that was both utterly alien and somehow familiar. Her hair was dark blue-black, braided with what looked like threads of light, and it moved as if it were underwater. But what struck me most was her presence, the way she commanded the space around her like gravity itself bent to her will. She fought the shadow creatures with a grace that was both deadly and beautiful, wielding energy weapons that seemed to be extensions of her own body. When the last of them dissolved back into the spaces between dimensions, she turned to me, and I saw something I hadn't expected in those alien eyes. Recognition. "You're the one the dream spoke of," she said, and her voice was like wind chimes made of silver and starlight. "The wanderer from the closed realm." I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a whisper. "I don't understand. What were those things? What is this place?" She knelt beside me, and I caught her scent, something like ozone and night-blooming jasmine. "You are in Zaharin, the realm between realms. I am Salra of the Night Guardians, and you are not supposed to be here." "I'm dreaming," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I doubted them. "This is just a lucid dream." She tilted her head, studying me with those impossible eyes. "If this is what you call dreaming, then dreams are more real than your people know. You crossed barriers that should not be crossed, walked paths that should not be walked. The shadow feeders were drawn to you like moths to flame. You burn bright in this realm, wanderer. Too bright." Before I could ask what she meant, the world began to dissolve around me. I felt myself being pulled back through layers of consciousness, back to the thin reality of my apartment. The last thing I saw was Syra's face, her expression mixing concern with something that might have been hope. I woke with her name on my lips and the taste of ozone in my mouth. But more than that, I woke with a longing so intense it felt like a physical wound. I'd been in the presence of something magnificent, something that made my ordinary world seem like a black and white photograph compared to living color. The next few days were torture. I couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except getting back to Zaharin. I researched hypnagogic techniques obsessively, trying to understand what I'd stumbled into. The few references I found were contradictory and vague, speaking of threshold states and dimensional bleeding in language that sounded more like poetry than science. When I finally managed to return, 4 days later, Salra was waiting for me. She stood on the same crystalline platform where I'd first arrived, but now she was dressed in what looked like armor made of liquid starlight. Her tail, something I'd been too overwhelmed to notice before, moved restlessly behind her, its tip glowing with the same light as her weapons. "You came back," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been relief. "I thought the crossing might have burned you out." "I had to," I said, and the honesty of it surprised me. "I haven't been able to think about anything else." She studied me for a long moment. "The shadow feeders are growing stronger. They're drawn to the barrier weaknesses, the places where reality grows thin. Your presence here, it's like a beacon to them, but it's also something else." She paused, her tail curling around her leg. "The old stories speak of a time when the barriers would fail, when the realms would bleed into each other. They say a wanderer from the closed realm would come, bearing the key to either salvation or destruction." "I don't have any key," I said. "I'm just a guy who can't sleep." "Perhaps," she said, but her eyes suggested she didn't believe it. "Come, if you're going to be here, you need to understand what you're walking into." She led me through the floating cities, showing me wonders that redefined my understanding of what was possible. We walked through districts where the buildings were grown rather than built, their walls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns. We crossed bridges of crystallized music that sang different harmonies depending on how you stepped on them. We visited markets where the vendors sold bottled emotions and liquid dreams, their wares glowing like captured aurora. But it was the people who fascinated me most. They moved with a fluid grace that made me feel clumsy and heavy, their skin shifting through subtle variations of blue and silver as their emotions changed. I noticed the social dynamics quickly, the way the females carried themselves with an authority that was both natural and absolute. The males were gentler, more given to artistic pursuits and spiritual contemplation, but they deferred to the females in all matters of importance. "In your realm," Salra explained as we walked, "the males dominate, yes? Here, we understand that strength comes in many forms. The females are the warriors, the protectors, the decision-makers. The males are the dreamers, the artists, the keepers of wisdom. Both are necessary, but leadership requires the will to act, and that comes more naturally to us." I found myself studying her as she spoke, the way her tail moved to emphasize her words, the way her eyes caught and reflected the strange light of her world. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with human standards of beauty, and everything to do with the perfect integration of form and function, grace and power. Over the following weeks, I returned to Zaharin every night I could manage the crossing. Some nights I failed, lying in bed as dawn approached, unable to find the precise mental state needed to slip between worlds. But when I succeeded, Salra was always there, waiting. She taught me to fight the shadow feeders, showing me how to channel the strange energy that flowed through Zaharin like a river of light. She explained that the realm existed in a state of constant flux, reshaped by the collective consciousness of its inhabitants. The floating cities moved, because the people willed them to move. The forests glowed because the trees had been taught to love the light. Reality is more flexible than your people believe, she told me one night as we stood on a platform, overlooking a valley filled with crystal formations that sang in harmonies that made my bones resonate. In your realm, you've forgotten how to dream with purpose. Here, we remember. I began to understand that Zaharin wasn't just a place. It was a state of being. The inhabitants lived in a constant state of lucid dreaming. Their consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of purely physical existence. They could reshape their world through focused intention, travel between the floating cities by willing themselves there, even communicate through something that was part telepathy and part shared dreaming. And I was falling in love with it all. Not just with Sailra, though that was becoming increasingly impossible to deny, but with the entire world. The way the light moved through the crystal forests, the way the aurora ribbons wrote poetry across the sky, the way the very air seemed to sing with possibilities. Zaharin was everything my own world wasn't. Beautiful, magical, alive in ways that made my daily existence feel like a slow death. But the shadow feeders were growing stronger. They attacked more frequently and in larger numbers. Sailra explained that they were drawn to the boundary weaknesses, the places where realities intersected. My presence, she said, was both blessing and curse. I strengthened the barriers by my very existence in their world, but I also attracted the attention of things that fed on the spaces between dimensions. There's a war coming, she told me one night as we stood guard on the outer platforms of one of the floating cities. The shadow feeders are organizing, preparing for something. The Council of Mothers fears they're trying to break through permanently, to establish a foothold in our realm. I watched her as she spoke, noting the way her tail moved restlessly, the way her eyes scanned the horizon for threats. What can I do to help? She turned to me, and for a moment, I saw something vulnerable in her expression. You could leave. Return to your realm and never come back. Without you here, the barriers would strengthen. The shadows would lose interest. Is that what you want? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. No, she said finally, but it may be what's necessary. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was ready to cross. I realized that whatever was happening between us was mutual, that the connection I felt wasn't one-sided. But I also realized that she was right about the danger. My presence was putting her world at risk. I should have left then. Should have gone back to my apartment, my job, my safe and empty life. But I couldn't. Zaharin had become more real to me than reality. Sailra had become more important than my own safety. I was addicted to the beauty, the magic, the sense of purpose I found in her world. So I stayed, and the war came to us. It started with the lights going out. I arrived one night to find the aurora ribbons flickering and fading, the glowing forests dimming to barely visible embers. The floating cities hung in the sky like dying stars, their bioluminescent walls pulsing weakly. Something was draining the life from Zaharin, sucking the light and magic out of the realm. Sailra met me at the platform, but she was different. Her usual armor was cracked and dim, her skin pale with exhaustion. They're inside the barriers, she said without preamble. The shadow feeders have found a way to establish permanent beachheads. They're feeding on the realm itself. We fought them together, night after night. I learned to channel the dying light of Zaharin into weapons of pure energy, to move through the floating cities like I was born to their impossible geography. But for every shadow feeder we destroyed, 2 more took its place. The realm was dying, and I was helpless to stop it. Worse, I was changing too. The crossings were becoming more difficult, requiring more of my strength each time. I'd wake up exhausted, with strange marks on my skin that looked like frostbite, but felt like burns. My apartment began to smell of ozone and alien flowers. Sometimes I'd find glowing leaves on my desk, fragments of Zaharin's forests, that had somehow followed me back. My body was weakening in the waking world. I called in sick to work, then stopped checking my email altogether. I barely ate, existing on coffee and the strange energy I absorbed in Zaharin. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, more real in the dream realm than in the world where I'd been born. The final battle came without warning. I crossed over to find Sailra waiting for me, but she was injured, her left arm wrapped in bandages that glowed with healing light. "It's tonight," she said. "The shadow feeders are making their final push. If they succeed, they'll tear the barriers down permanently. Both realms will be destroyed." We fought like we never had before, moving through the dying cities as the sky above us began to crack like broken glass. The shadow feeders came in waves, their forms more solid and aggressive than ever before. I could feel Zaharin's life force ebbing with each attack, the realm's magic bleeding away into the void. In the end, it came down to a choice. As the final wave of shadow feeders broke against our defenses, Sailra turned to me with tears in her impossible eyes. "You have to go," she said. "Now, while you still can. The barriers are collapsing. If you stay, you'll be trapped here when the realm dies." I looked at her, at the world that had become my home, at the beauty that was fading like a dying star. "What about you?" "I'll hold them as long as I can," she said. "Give the others time to escape to the deeper realms. But you don't belong here, Caleb. You have a life in the closed realm, a world that needs you." "No," I said, and the word felt like a stone in my throat. "I don't have a life there. I have an existence, a routine, a slow death by degrees. This is my life. You are my life." She reached out and touched my face, her fingers warm against my skin. "Then you'll die with me when the realm collapses. Is that what you want?" I thought about my apartment, my job, my careful isolation from everything that mattered. I thought about the star charts on my walls, the dreams I'd abandoned, the life I'd never really lived. Then I looked at Sailra, at the world we'd defended together, at the love that had grown between us like a flower in the darkness. "Yes," I said, "that's what I want." The light was fading from her eyes, but she smiled. "Then stay, my brave wanderer. Stay and dream with me." The final assault came like a tsunami of darkness. The shadow feeders poured through the broken barriers, their forms blotting out the dying moons. We fought them together, our energies intertwined, our consciousness merging as the realm collapsed around us. I felt Sailra's life force flowing into me, and mine into her, until we were no longer separate beings, but part of the same fading dream. The last thing I saw was a blinding flash of light, brighter than all the stars in both our skies. Then there was nothing but peace, and the sound of her voice, whispering my name in a language that had no words. They found my body 3 days later, after my landlord got worried and called for a wellness check. I was lying in bed, peaceful but unresponsive, my vital signs stable, but my brain showing patterns the doctors had never seen before. They called it a coma, but the EEG readings suggested something else entirely. Theta waves and delta waves intertwined in impossible combinations, as if my consciousness was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. I've been in this state for 6 months now, though I don't experience it as coma. I exist in a space between spaces, a realm that is neither Zaharin nor Earth, but something new, something born from the collision of two realities. Sometimes I can feel the hospital room around me, hear the doctors talking in hushed voices, sense the presence of people who move through my life like ghosts. But mostly, I exist in the place I chose to stay. It's different from Zaharin, smaller and more intimate, shaped by the love between Sailra and me. We're together here, in this pocket of surviving dream, and though the wider realm's gone, we've preserved something precious in its destruction. The doctors don't understand the leaf they found on my bedside table, the one that glows with soft inner light and never withers. They've run tests trying to determine its composition, its origin, its impossible properties. But they can't explain how a plant that doesn't exist in any earthly taxonomy came to be in a locked room on the 15th floor of a city hospital. I could explain it to them if I could speak. I could tell them about the barriers between worlds, about the power of love to transcend the boundaries of what we call real. I could tell them about the choice I made to stay in a dying dream rather than return to a life that was never truly alive. But I can't speak, can't move, can't open my eyes to the world I left behind. I exist now in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts, in the moment when sleep becomes dream and dream becomes something more than dream. And I'm happy here. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong, with the person I was meant to find. The realm we inhabit is small, but it's ours, built from the love that survived the destruction of everything else. We are the last guardians of Zaharin's memory, the final keepers of its impossible beauty. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. But then I feel Sayura's hand in mine, hear her voice singing the songs of her people, see the light that still glows in her eyes, and I know that some things are worth any price. The monitors in my hospital room beep steadily, marking time in a world that has forgotten how to dream. But here, in the space between spaces, time moves differently. Here, love is stronger than death, and dreams are more real than the waking world. Here, I am home.